You know, Matthew's a unique case because he's a twin and his arm doesn't extend all the way, and his hips, he has some orthopedic problems, so he couldn't explore his environment like typical children. But, so he was a little delayed on that account, but he was interacting with his brother and they would play hide and seek games and giggle and laugh, and he was very engaged and alert and bright. When we got the MMR shot, we went into a year of screaming where he screamed for 24 hours a day almost. It was almost unbearable. And we got the diagnosis when he was 2.5 that he had autism and a pretty severe form of it. And you know when you have a child who's there that they get these shots and all of a sudden they're different, and it's just not, there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, because we saw what Matthew was and how he was going, and then what's happened. I wish I hadn't listened to the doctor who said that you have to vaccinate your child. But she didn't know better herself. You know, she was, I think, giving me the best information that she had at the time, really. So.
The children who are here, their parents will tell you, were definitely injured by vaccines. They were fine, and then they were gone. So if I have parents screaming, and I have science confirming that there's a problem with exposure to mercury, and there's a problem with exposure to aluminum, and there's a problem when you take a broken immune system and give it 3 live viruses on the same day, then why don't we just want to fix that? It's ridiculous that there are this many children in one little town, in one little pool, all of them who have the same story.
The health authorities have assumed that more vaccination will equal better public health and better individual health, that more is better. But where is the evidence? Where is the biological evidence that it is better to give more and more vaccines in early childhood to prevent all infection in childhood? That will equal better individual and public health over the long term. I have a brochure that we did that shows parents how many vaccines their children get by the age 6, 48 doses of 14 vaccines. These are vaccines that the Centers for Disease Control says our children need to receive at these different ages. We start out at 12 hours of age in the newborn nursery with hepatitis B vaccine. That means a baby in our country, the first immunological experience they have is with hepatitis B vaccine, when we really know very little about a child at the newborn age. Then at 2 months, all of these vaccines are recommended at 4 months, 6 months, and between 12 and 18 months, and then between 4 and 6 years. So a number of these in this area are boosters, such as an MMR booster, a DTaP booster. We now have our children receiving flu vaccine starting at 6 months of age, and then recommended every year up through 5 years that they get a flu shot, when there are really no studies showing that it's effective to give little children this flu vaccine every year or safe. We've more than doubled the numbers of vaccines we give our children in the last quarter century. Why are we so afraid of microorganisms that we are willing to vaccinate every child with more and more vaccines without understanding whether or not that is actually causing long-term disability and chronic illness in a growing minority of children? Are we trading off the elimination of infectious disease in early childhood for chronic disease and disability for an entire life?
We are here today on behalf of tens of thousands of families of vaccine-injured autistic children to appeal to pediatrician members of the American Academy of Pediatrics to change their policies and protect children from being harmed by vaccines.
I have 7-year-old triplets, and they were happy, healthy, bright. They love to play and investigate. And then we took them in for their well baby visit, and they got multiple vaccines, including the MMR. And within weeks of that, 2 of my children, my son and one of my daughters, just went away. It's total insanity. They tell you the vaccines are mandatory, and that's a lie, and they don't tell you what's in it. You know, it's mercury, aluminum, formaldehyde, and antifreeze. Neurotoxic viruses. It's a toxic soup.
He had the MMR, which is for measles, mumps, and rubella. Then he had Varivax for chickenpox. He had Meningitech, which is for meningitis. And he had Prevnar, which is for pneumococcal infections. All on June 22nd, the same day. 1 vaccination on each arm and 1 on each leg. Then, what happened was like encephalitis. So they diagnosed him as having epileptogenic encephalopathy of unknown origin. When he woke up from the coma, Alexei couldn't swallow, Alexei couldn't stand up, Alexei couldn't talk, Alexei couldn't walk. We had to start all over with a new baby. Except that we don't know whether he'll ever develop again like a normal child.
Show them the thimerosal bottle, which we keep in a metal container because we're a little afraid of it, and it's a very fine powder.
This is thimerosal, which is labeled very toxic. Has cumulative effects, can cause damage to the kidneys, to the respiratory system, skin, to the nervous system. It specifically warns on here that it can cause reproductive and developmental toxicity, meaning that it can cause things like autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. This is immensely toxic stuff.
And it's a vaccine.
And this is what's in the vaccine. It's important to realize we're talking about a whole range of products. Vaccines are a big one because, of course, you're directly injecting it. For example, this is tetanus vaccine. This one expires, it's a little outdated now, in 2007. And here's the thimerosal. 1 to 10,000 is a preservative. Perhaps the biggest one in the U.S., at least, that's for exposure to mercury is the influenza vaccine. Influenza vaccine is now recommended for all pregnant women, all infants, all children on a yearly basis. You're supposed to
have last year's influenza one? Understand that thimerosal is not added at the end. It's not like, well, that factory next year can make thimerosal free. Thimerosal, you either have to have a thimerosal free factory or you have to not have one. They add thimerosal at each step because the factory is not clean and not sterile. So you either have to have an expensive sterile factory where you don't need thimerosal, or you have to have one that produces thimerosal. It's going to need thimerosal or something the whole time. It needs to be stopped.
This is the influenza vaccine from Adventist Pasteur, their flu zone. Thimerosal. 25 micrograms of mercury per dose.
But I'd like to point out that a lot of people didn't know, and I'm one of them. I've given 2,000 RhoGAM shots. I've been in vaccines for 35 years. I didn't know that RhoGAM had thimerosal in it, so I think a lot of the doctors were unaware. They were unaware that even the word thimerosal meant mercury.
Ah. Bonjour, mademoiselle Masto. Bonjour, monsieur Frézal. Et là, on a lancé nos patients hier. On va pouvoir les lire dans la journée?
Voilà, je vais pouvoir vous donner un truc. La réponse est bonne.
La réponse est bonne. Et les premières ébauches? Nous avons été sollicités.
We were asked to explore the biology of autistic children, and there was in the pathogens of such children a problem of possible mercury poisoning. Mercury is a particular toxin insofar as it's not found in biological fluids. Once it enters the organism, after 3 months, it spreads and hides in tissues. So we had to find a physiological profile, a profile of biochemical activity that would reveal the presence of mercury. We had opted some dozen years ago to investigate urine. In the urine, we were looking for components called porphyrins. What are these porphyrins? They're components essential to life. They help us use oxygen and allow us to produce energy in our cells, and strangely enough, help us fight toxins. We checked the levels of porphyrins in the urine of autistic children and discovered they were very high. Not all porphyrins, but the metabolic variety, the components specific to mercury poisoning.
Là, nous allons pouvoir commencer à intégrer les échantillons.
There are two major groups of heavy metals, lead and mercury. Our bodies aren't programmed to process lead and mercury. There's no place in the metabolic structure of our bodies for lead and mercury. We have no way of processing them. We have no way of eliminating them. We have no way of storing them. They're intruders. Some intruders we know about are passive, inactive. Many toxins are intruders. They're passive and inactive. They can be somewhat detoxified and do no harm, but lead and mercury have a special toxic action of their own. For example, lead blocks the building of the porphyrins that I mentioned. If we have fewer porphyrins, our dialogue with oxygen is cut back. We produce less energy. Mercury is even more complicated because we have in our cells something that's like a country. Yes, we can compare a cell to a country. The cell creates substances and then has to transport them. In our country, we have factories, and then we have to carry and transport the materials to the places where we need them. To do this, we need a transport network. Roads, railroads, shipping canals. That's true for cells, too. The cell has what we call a cytoskeleton and a transportation network, which is a network of tubulins. Boyd Haley and other scientists have shown that when you suffer from mercury poisoning, the mercury prevents the building of the transport network that goes to the extremities, to the outer reaches of the cell, and that will carry what's created in the cell through protein synthesis to the places it's needed. Mercury is like a highway accident. That's the way it acts. The result is a weakening of the cell's functioning. And when a cell weakens, it starts making mistakes. It begins creating malformations. That's a little what we see in lesions typical of Alzheimer's. We observe areas of neurodegeneration because protein synthesis is disrupted. That can be explained, though for the moment these are only hypotheses.
The mercury has got to go. Hey, hey! Ho, ho! The mercury has got to go. Hey, hey! Ho, ho! The mercury has got to go. Hey, hey! Ho, ho! The mercury has got to go. Hey, hey! Ho, ho! The mercury has got to go. Hey, hey! Ho, ho! The mercury has got to go.
Okay, would you please rise and be sworn? Do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Seated. Everybody knows the value of vaccinations, and every time you testify, you tell us how valuable they've been, and we already know that. We're not here to say that vaccinations aren't important. They're very important. They've given us the highest quality of life of any civilization in the history of mankind. That ain't what we're talking about. We're talking about why they're putting mercury in vaccinations and why it's never been tested since 1929 when Lilly developed it. Mr. Egan, has thimerosal ever been tested by our health agencies?
It's been only there were those early tests that you know of that were done by Lilly.
And when was that test done? That was done in 1929.
Yes. And
okay, well, let's follow up on that. In 1929, they tested this on 27 people that were dying of meningitis. All of those people died of meningitis, and so they said there was no correlation between their death and the mercury in the vaccines. That is the only test that's ever been done on thimerosal that I know of. Can you think of any other?
No, in people, no.
Okay,
Except for accidental exposures, overexposure.
Okay, so we have mercury that's being put into people's bodies in the form of this preservative, and has been since the 30s, and it's never been tested by our health agencies. And yet, you folks come here and you testify that there's no conclusive evidence, and the IOM says they favor, get this, they don't say they're sure, they say they favor rejection of a causal relationship between mercury and autism and other neurological disorders. Mr. Egan, can you say to me right now that that amount of mercury being injected into a baby will not hurt it?
It's impossible to make those categorical statements of 100%.
That's right. That's what I want you to say.
Scientific endeavor.
So it is possible that the amount of mercury that's being injected, even in trace amounts, could damage a child neurologically, right?
I don't think it has that capacity. No. I mean, that's, we can argue.
I know, but you don't think it is, but you can't say categorically, can you?
Do I have evidence for every single child, for every possible dose? The answer is no.
There you go. We've been after this now for 8 years. Now, progress is being made, but sometimes I feel like it's pulling a wisdom tooth where they get in your mouth with both feet and both hands and they're jerking that tooth out. I mean, it's just so hard to get it moving. Why they have left it in the vaccines is because they say it's such a minute amount, it doesn't really hurt anybody. But that's begging the question. The question is it toxic or not? And it is. It should be out of everything that goes into the human body. And our health agencies, in my opinion, have been derelict in their responsibility of making sure that mercury is out of everything that goes into the human body, especially vaccines.
Salut. Salut. Ça va bien? Oui, merci, merci.
Bonjour. Tu vas bien?
Oui. Vous avez fait trop de monde?
Non, personne sur la route.
I was vaccinated when I was in high school, when I was 13 or 14. I got the vaccine against hepatitis B, since they said that it was transmittable through saliva, and at the time that was the only kind of contact we had, with our boyfriends. They said a kiss can kill you. Actually, it was the young people's virus, the AIDS virus. It was all blown up in the media. I get an attack every 6 months or so. The last time it affected my motor function. I couldn't walk. Actually, I could still walk, but really slowly, and, well, the way people stare is really hurtful. Because I walk like I'm drunk because my movements, they aren't at all coordinated. I couldn't feel my hands. I mean, I was really awkward because now I knock over a lot of stuff. I run into things because I got double vision and it never really went away. Now my field of vision where I see things clearly from about here, I see double now from this point on. So all of this, I see double. So I run into things, and I think that's why on the bus or on escalators, on the stairs or in the street, I fall a lot. I fall all the time because I can't visualize things, and now I can't drive anymore.
The case of vaccination in France would come to be cited in public health studies as an example of exactly what not to do. Everything began with a report from the World Health Organization, the advice of the WHO that said, we need to vaccinate the entire population if we want to eradicate hepatitis B. Let me remind you that in France there was, at the time it was estimated, that there was between 1/10 and 3/10% of the population that carried the virus. That's a very small percentage. In the days that followed, there was an actual panic in France. People rushed to the pharmacy to buy the vaccine, and people were vaccinated from the age of 1 to 75. Grandparents who brought their grandchildren to doctors asked them, what about me? What about us? Can't we be vaccinated? Of course, sir. Of course, madam. We'll vaccinate you. So we vaccinated people who were at absolutely no risk of catching hepatitis B. I'm a doctor. I treated cases of hepatitis B, and I never got vaccinated. I had no reason to be vaccinated because I had no chance of infection. To be infected, I would need to have sexual relations with patients who had hepatitis B. But my code of ethics doesn't permit that sort of thing. Or I'd have to be in contact with the patient's blood. But I'm not in contact with the patient's blood. The nurses are. Or I'd have to be a drug user, and I'm not a drug user. I'm not a homosexual either, and I don't have a multitude of sexual partners. So I have no real risk of being infected with hepatitis B. So I didn't get vaccinated. But we vaccinated in the service I was in charge of. We vaccinated secretaries because they were in contact with the patient's files that could have contained the virus. It was madness.
Here it is, my vehicle. At the house, I don't need it. In my car either, of course. You see, this is freedom. It's freedom because I can move around without slowing the people down who are accompanying me, without taking drugs all the time and being in constant pain. It's a great invention. It's practical, too. Depends on the sidewalk, but it's better than nothing. Let's go. I was getting ready to train a technician for a photovoltaic installation. I used to do that as a volunteer during my vacations. At the time, my doctor told me for Guadeloupe it's better to get the hepatitis A vaccine. I was vaccinated at the end of 1999 or the beginning of 2000, and around the end of the year 2000, I was having trouble sleeping. I had pains. My skin was sensitive to the touch. In the meantime, they eliminated this, that, and the other, ankylosing polyarthritis and rheumatism. They work by process of elimination. They thought it might be fibromyalgia, things like that. And then there was this famous article about macrophagic myofasciitis and the link to aluminum contained in vaccines and the syndrome that they could isolate or find through a biopsy.
Ah oui. Alors voilà, un PS, quand c'est bien fait, ça donne satisfaction. Ça, c'est sur une paraffine. Eh bien, la biopsie musculaire...
Muscular biology is one of the keys to diagnosing neuromuscular illnesses. These are rare illnesses, but there are many of them. I think we've isolated...
répertorié
350, something like that. One different illness a day, you could say, for every day of the year.
Voilà, ici on voit beaucoup mieux.
Look, we see it much more clearly.
Vous avez ici un muscle.
Here we have a deltoid muscle.
Ce muscle est composé de plusieurs.
This muscle is composed of several muscular bundles wrapped in connective tissue called a fascia. We perform a muscular biopsy, which is a surgical removal of part of the muscle. In this connective tissue, in the white part at this level, is where we find the lesion due to macrophagic myofasciitis. We can examine this material in an electron microscope that magnifies it many times over, and you'll see that in the cytoplasm of this macrophage there are dark structures, somewhat heterogeneous, and that when they're magnified to a very high degree, show a fibrous or crystal structure that makes them a nanoparticle or a nanomaterial. And when we analyze it through different biophysical procedures, we can prove that these are nanocrystals of aluminum hydroxide, in other words, a vaccine adjuvant.
D'hydroxyde d'aluminium, c'est-à-dire l'adjuvant vaccinal.
Allô? Oui, bonjour.
Aluminum is currently a very important component of vaccines, but not of all vaccines. It's what we call an adjuvant. When you vaccinate someone for a virus, in fact, what you're doing is vaccinating a part of the viral particle, a fragment of the virus, plus the adjuvant, which stimulates immunity to the viral particle. If we injected only the viral particle into a person, he or she would never achieve immunity. Immunity is achieved only because of the adjuvant. Its role is to stimulate immunity. It attracts immunity and immune cells. It says, look, here's a bit of virus. Do your immunity process so that when you recognize it, when you meet it the next time, you'll destroy it immediately. That's the role of what we call the adjuvant that stimulates immunity and turns it against the viral particle.
As far as aluminum hydroxide is concerned specifically, it was introduced into vaccines in 1927. Since we considered that it was eliminated a few days after the injection, no one asked questions about the long-term toxicity of the adjuvant. Not since 1927. People came to agree that aluminum hydroxide was a good adjuvant in terms of the immune response sought by vaccines. And in terms of safety, it posed no problem because all safety issues were considered over the short term only.
Among people who have macrophagic myofasciitis, if they come 10 years later for another vaccine, and we do a muscle biopsy before, we discover the presence of aluminum, which would suggest that these people are predisposed, for reasons we don't yet know, genetically, molecularly, or for other reasons, they're predisposed to not destroy the aluminum or sufficiently eliminate it.
I'd say that from 2000 to 2002, no one asked me any questions about vaccines. 2003, 2002, 2003, no questions either. Sometimes I brought it up, and each time I did, I got a reaction, like an immediate and practically unanimous reaction from the medical men who said, no, there can't be, there's no link. It was proved. Even for multiple sclerosis, there's no relation. So every time I couldn't have a discussion, their ears were closed.
Unfortunately, patients suffering from macrophagic myofasciitis face a kind of block, a mental block from the medical community that won't question vaccines in light of the benefits that they've helped bring to human health. On the other hand, the patients develop a group of symptoms with which most doctors aren't yet, let's say, comfortable. They don't trust what the patients are telling them.
Pas en confiance avec ce dont on parle. Et puis il y a un troisième niveau de blocage que je veux pas qu'on va.
And then there's a third level of blockage, and I don't want to minimize it, in the industry. Here I'm talking about the industrial strategies that have decided to use aluminum hydroxide as an adjuvant, and that, well, unless they're absolutely forced to, they won't revise that decision, because their industrial production is based on the product, and so there would be large and considerable costs. And if they are not obliged to change the adjuvant, well, then they won't change. Not unless all the medical, scientific, and legal facts have been clearly laid out.
Scientifiques, judiciaires n'auront pas été clairement exposés.
Merci. Et t'avais dit aussi des légumes si tu faisais une soupe, non? Non.
J'ai de la flemme en général.
Ah bon?
Alors Antoine.
If we start talking about the hundreds or thousands of accidents due to vaccines, then people will stop getting vaccinated. That would be terrible for humanity. Diseases would return. They'd cause terrible damage. That's what we hear from the other side. At the same time, do we have to accept that we happen to be part of the 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100,000 who have to be sacrificed for the good of public health? When other people are concerned, we say it's hard enough. But when it happens to us, how are we supposed to react?
Non, mais ce qui va, c'est que Aurélie, elle a le moral et puis elle nous donne aussi la force de passer au-dessus de tout ça, quoi. Et c'est sûr que c'est une dure épreuve. Surtout, on préférait que ce soit à nous que ce soit arrivé qu'à Aurélie qui a encore toute sa vie devant elle. C'est surtout ça qui est difficile à accepter, quoi.
Oh, je peux pas parler. Non, c'est le fait qu'on n'en parle jamais, en fait. Que là, ça remonte d'un coup.
Surtout Lionel, hein. Moi, oui.
Si j'avais pas, en fait, l'aide de mes parents, ça aurait été super dur, quoi.
I thoroughly enjoyed life. I enjoyed being outside. I enjoyed being with my family. I loved playing sports. I loved just doing everything. When I got sick, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even look outside. I had cardboard over my windows, and I couldn't just even look outside. It was just unbearable. The light was just so powerful, and I just could not stand it. I couldn't stand hearing birds because they were just so loud. And it was... Nothing else made sense to why I was sick. I couldn't believe that just that little bit from a vaccine would make me that sick, because I never heard of it before. And I wasn't eating. I lost 43 pounds in 8 weeks. They put me on steroids to try and get me to eat as a last-ditch effort to get me to eat. And during that time, it also reduced any brain swelling, possible brain swelling. And then I was able to speak that night, and I told my dad that I thought I reacted to the vaccine.
And it was like I was right there again, watching her in the chair and knowing that, she was dying and couldn't stop it. And then to have the the situation occur with the physician. And he prescribed vitamin A, and the other doctors had called and said, you know, she'll never hold a job, she'll never be able to go to school, she'll never be able to live on her own, she'll require deep psychoanalysis the rest of her life. And oh, by the way, we don't want to see her again. And those 7 physicians all just gave up. You know, professionals have abandoned you. They've abandoned you, and they base it upon your inadequacies and your, you know, your emotions and your desire to find a reason. Instead of saying, you know, they're just reporting. Come on, you know, these people aren't hysterical. You know, we aren't doting on our only daughter. We had other children as well, and we had to take care of their needs. And just the fact that we were here, you had the audacity to claim that we are, you know, hysterical kinds of parents is just, that is so demeaning. That is so demeaning. And you know, they just don't take you as an individual into consideration at all. And, you know, they'll talk like they do, but they don't. So, you know, that's a huge frustration to me. And the fact that they walk around denying today that there is any causative relationship, to me, is just, it's nonsensical. It's like, well, how do you suppose all this happened? And then to go back and say, well, we just know how to diagnose better. I mean, that is such a put down on parents. It is such a put down on people who are concerned. And it's such a put down on people like Stephanie, who've recovered and they're trying to tell the world, this is how to do it. This worked for me. How do they justify that? I find that unconscionable. Totally unconscionable. So get over yourselves, medical community. You know, wake up and smell the roses. Wake up and realize there is a causative relationship.
If we talk about the children who have learning disabilities, who weren't born that way, but who have learning disabilities, if we talk about the children who develop ADD, attention deficit disorder, if we talk about the children who have PDD, the pervasive developmental disorder, Asperger's, every kind of disease process that you can talk about that has this neurologic learning problem, when we add those children into the mix, and I believe firmly that they should be added, that they are all on one spectrum and it's one process, you're talking about one child in every 6. And those numbers were not like that. You will talk to teacher after teacher who's been in this business of teaching children for 30 years, and they will all tell you, it wasn't like that when I started teaching, it's like that now. And something has changed. And they laugh, the teachers laugh, when a physician says, oh, it's just better diagnosis. They were all there before. I can promise you that if you had had this many children walking through grocery stores having full-on meltdown temper tantrums, 30 years ago, it would have been diagnosed as autism.
Très bien le sujet, qui est honnête et puis qui pourra faire sortir des choses si on lui amène quelque chose à se mettre sous la dent.
In these files, compiled since 1997, we find all the patients who were victims of the side effects of the hepatitis B vaccine and various pathologies, including neurological, rheumatological, dermatological, ophthalmological, all the autoimmune diseases, including multiple sclerosis. For those who suffer side effects, who have diminished abilities, who lost their professional life, who are often destabilized in their family life and their ability to make a living, it's quite terrible.
To say that it's completely random and that the media urge people to make these declarations and that they declare all the diseases you can catch by accident outside of vaccination, they declare these to us.
We can try and illustrate what you're saying on a chart. This is a chart based on the data from the National Health Insurance Fund that compares the number of vaccine doses sold in France. There's a spike, obviously, between 1994 and 1996, with more than 30 million vaccinations. Now, we see that before this vaccine spike, there were between 8,000 and 9,000 people each year who began suffering from rheumatoid polyarthritis. But we see that from 1995 onward, there's a regular increase every year in the number of polyarthritis cases confirmed. We come up with similar figures if we take the number of, for example, cases of ankylosing spondylarthritis. We notice a statistically significant increase starting in 1995-96, and the same goes for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. So we'd have to ask the question about these autoimmune diseases, whether people who developed an autoimmune disease were vaccinated. Just ask them, were you vaccinated or were you not? Then beginning with that very simple notion, we could establish a study, an eventual causality, a link. It would be very easy to answer that question, but no one wants to ask it.
We asked the AFSAPs, after explaining the statistical project that could be carried out, to cooperate with us, since all their data, essentially 80% of it, is in files that are here with us. Instead of sending us all the data, they sent us filtered data. For example, to take one important example, they provided data without the age of the victims. Well, multiple sclerosis that appears at the age of 5 or 6 is not the same thing as a case of MS that appears at the age of 50. So why don't they want to give us the age since they know it? The answer? Because it might violate patient confidentiality. You understand, when you see that kind of excuse, it's obvious that there's opposition to exposing the truth about the undesirable effects of vaccines.
When it comes to evaluating drug safety, including vaccines, the public health authorities carry out a study of all available data. From the industry point of view, there is an obligation to report to the health authorities all undesirable effects that they know of. In addition, in France, we have a system of reporting adverse drug reactions to our regional centers. And we have notification independent of anything coming from the industry. We have at least 2 sources of notification of undesirable effects.
I saw that the regional AFSAPS agencies didn't all have the same rates of rejection. I discovered 2 regions where the rejection rates were greater and concerned exactly the types of diseases that are unfortunately relatively frequent with undesirable vaccine effects. And we can see that this filtering is linked to a human decision. The victims come up against this kind of wall. It's an ideological barrier, I believe. People say, how could that be? Vaccines are designed to protect. They can't do harm. That's the kind of thought process behind this filtering, even when a declaration is made.
Here, this is the Vidal 1995 edition. Angélique says that its vaccine can produce certain undesirable effects, such as fatigue, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, but also more serious things, such as anaphylactic allergic reactions, neurological side effects, paralysis, neuropathy, neuritis, including Guillain-Barré syndrome, multiple sclerosis. And then we get to autoimmune diseases, such as arthritis, vascular problems, phenomena like that. So there we tripled the
list of side effects.
The list of side effects that same year, 1995.
Vaccines, like other medication, can create undesirable effects, sometimes very serious ones. As long as these serious undesirable side effects remain rare, we can accept them at the level of the population as a whole. Accepting them at the level of the individual is another problem. It's true that when you have in front of you a patient who was in good health, who was vaccinated, and then suffers a serious undesirable side effect, it's very difficult to accept that on an individual level.
Vaccines are hurting far more people than the health authorities ever expected. And they continue to embrace this pseudo-ethic of utilitarianism in order to justify not doing the scientific studies that will find out who is at high risk, who is at genetic and biological high risk of suffering from vaccination and not being able to handle vaccination, because they continue to say, well, you know, that's the price of doing business. If some get hurt, that's for the greater good. And that's why I am so against utilitarianism propping up any public policy of any kind, because it's a very slippery slope. How many is too many to sacrifice? Is it 500? 5,000? 500,000? How many do you say it's okay to write off in the name of the greater good in order to protect the public from disease?
Cela, tu n'as pas perfusé, tu as coupé les exsanguinés puis tu as coupé chacun des hémisphères, c'est ça? Alors nous, on est un laboratoire.
Our laboratory works on a new science called neuroimmunology. We especially work on different models involving acute infections, for example, meningitis, encephalitis caused by viruses or bacteria. We also work on chronic illnesses such as Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, and Lou Gehrig's disease. These are neurodegenerative diseases that have an immune system component. In other words, they involve certain immune cells that we call microglia cells. All those issues concern us, questions about the role of the immune response on the brain. What does the response actually do? And how can we use it as a therapeutic tool? The brain's immune system is composed of cells that we call microglia. They're a little like the macrophagic cells we find in the periphery. We have as many microglia cells as we do neurons. It's a one-to-one relationship. The difference is that microglia cells aren't organized in specific regions or in centers the way neurons are. They more or less cover all the cerebral tissue, white matter as well as gray matter. We can see here this small cell that looks like an octopus. These continual ramifications in the cerebral tissue will branch out to see what's going on in the brain, if there's a possible presence of material that could be toxic for the neurons. As soon as there's a problem, you'll see millions of cells move toward the center, where the problem is, to try to take charge of the immune system environment that's become very aggressive in the brain. It's a very dynamic cell. Contrary to what we first thought. It's the only cell that has that characteristic of refining its ramifications, extending its immune system arms through the tissue, through nerve system tissue, actually.
On a toujours les trois groupes, le groupe qui est LPS, le groupe irradie et le groupe contrôle.
Okay. L'irradiation, c'est quand même... Ça, c'est LPS aussi.
C'est LPS.
Donc, l'irradiation commence à partir aussi.
C'est ça. Ici, si vous voyez, 24 heures, irradié ici.
Il faut dire que les cellules immunitaires microgliales...
The immune system microglia cells produce a lot of inflammatory molecules that are involved in the inflammation response. But this response, as you know, is a double-edged sword. The inflammatory response is there to protect, but it can also become very strong, exaggerated, and long-lasting. It can have serious consequences, in fact, on cerebral tissue. One of the serious consequences of the inflammatory response of microglia activity that isn't controlled in an appropriate manner is a degeneration of the white matter. The scientific term is demyelization. The microglia cells don't know what to do. They become overactive in cases like this, and the inflammatory response becomes too strong. The consequences are serious. They can lead to death, or if the person survives, they can lead to cognitive deficiencies or even permanent damage to regions of the brain.
Laura Lee was a full-term baby. She was born with microcephaly. Her skull size was less than the average.
Up until the age of 4 months, Laura Lee was developing relatively normally. After her vaccination, she started having a lot of problems. She lost much of her psychomotor progress and her intellectual abilities too. Now she's 8 years old and she still can't walk or talk. She's dependent on someone else for her every need, for even the smallest thing.
When Laura Lee started reacting 45 minutes after the vaccination, right away I knew it was the vaccine. There was no doubt. This is the vaccine's monograph. Pharmaceutical companies produce these documents where you have the description and the products used. They talk about the precautions you should take for children who have neurological problems that are confirmed or suspected, because these children are possibly at risk of developing some major neurological problems. Infants and children with recognized possible or potential underlying neurological conditions seem to be at enhanced risk for the appearance of manifestations of the underlying neurological disorder within 2 or 3 days following whole cell pertussis DTP vaccination. To administer Pentacel to children with proven or suspected underlying neurological disorders must be decided on an individual basis after consideration of the risks and benefits. Why isn't this information given before every vaccine? For sure, if I'd read that before the vaccination, we wouldn't have vaccinated her. That's for sure.
The pattern of immune response is very, very different from one person to the next, and also very different depending on the kind of infection they had and at what age they had it. Was the person young, a baby? Was it a perinatal infection? Was the brain sufficiently developed? Was the hemoencephalic barrier completely formed at the time of the infection? Was there a history of meningitis? Let's say a year ago an antibiotic saved the baby. Everything is okay now, but his innate immunity has been changed, right? But you're going to go ahead and vaccinate on top of that. But vaccinating on top of that doesn't mean you're going to kill the child, or that you're necessarily going to cause illness. But it means if there's an immune pattern different from one person to the next, that might explain everything we know about the sensitivity of certain persons to infection, or to the preparation of certain vaccines. And all that can increase the risk of chronic disorders, among other things.
What we went through, and the different stages of the follow-up at the hospital that were inevitable after Laura Lee was admitted after the vaccination. We realized that we just could not sensitize the practitioners who were working with her. They were closed to any thought that maybe the vaccine might have been responsible. They always had a kind of, how can I put it, a contempt, a complete misunderstanding about what we were asking them. It was like, for them, we were talking about something completely impossible.
You know, they don't put that down in the medical records. They don't talk about it. They don't want to talk about it, that's for sure. We felt that completely right from the start.
That's true.
It's a taboo subject, completely taboo.
For sure, from that point onward, we really started a process to be evaluated by a committee. An evaluation committee to receive compensation after the vaccination. That's really what got everything going with the ministry.
We set up a program to both promote vaccination and compensate the victims of vaccination. That was our way of saying we're encouraging you to get vaccinated. And if ever there's a problem, we'll have a program to compensate you. It's a social type of program to protect victims and protect the public. The problem we have currently is that this program is not really being applied in a way that achieves its goal, insofar as we're much too demanding about the cause and effect relation with the vaccine. In other words, if it isn't established scientifically by numerous studies, we'll reject the claim. I think that here again, the process has become so heavy. The trial process we're using now perverts the nature of the program. It's unfair to force citizens to hire lawyers, experts, exactly the way it was before and exactly what we wanted to avoid. And now we're reproducing the same model.
For the parent who has a child who is completely healthy and who, over time, associates a vaccine with a side effect, he could believe that the prejudice is located there. The analysis, the choice that was made in Quebec in relation to that was to adopt a biomedical approach, to see what the scientific literature had to say, and to see what other causes could explain the phenomenon, and if, without having all the criteria of a causal relation that is usual in science, if we don't locate other causes, or if there are no clues pointing to an underlying phenomenon from the past, we'll give the benefit of the doubt.
I've been working for several years on the consequences of the anti-hepatitis B vaccine. The study was begun around 7 or 8 years ago. What I can tell you is this. One of the big problems with public health issues regarding the anti-hepatitis B vaccine is to determine the cause and effect relationship between the pathologies. I use the plural pathologies because there are several that could be linked with vaccinations. That's the difficulty that creates enormous problems because it's true, science isn't a certainty. We can't ask an uncertain science to give us complete proof to obtain justice.
What still strikes me is the contrast between official reality, decisions, expert opinions. Doctors, they're not crazy. They're specialists in the field. We have publications from France, Greece, the United States, Australia, everywhere. And they've established the reality of the thing and the slowness to be polite of certain people to admit that what's real is true. The consequences of all that are that we are forced to provide expert opinions and hire counter-experts and get more expert witnesses and start all over again. At the end of the month, I'm going to plead on the evidence of the counter-expert witnesses who are being thrown back in my face because supposedly the experts have already said such and such. Well, if you ask me, the experts got it wrong. I think we'll win eventually.
What disturbs me the most is the number of victims who have to get along on their own. In France, there are 125 people who received official compensation from the Department of National Health. 125. And yet we have 2,700 files on people who suffered serious side effects.
Including deaths?
Yes, including deaths, of course.
Let's try to understand what happened and why there are so many victims who have such trouble getting compensation and having their rights recognized. And how is it that out of the billions spent on vaccination, that we haven't freed up a couple of millions so that they might have what they need to live, not exactly normally, but that would help them with the difficulties they face?
My prejudices on it, which was if you walked in my office 5 years ago before I learned all about this, I would have looked down my nose on you. What do you mean you didn't get your child vaccinated? Your child should be vaccinated. Your child could get seriously injured. That's what we've all been led to believe, because there's a lot of truth in that statement. But there's also a lot of truth, unfortunately, in the statement is your child also could be severely damaged and injured if you get the vaccine. So let's tell the other side of the story too. Let's make sure parents and teachers and administrators and everybody out there knows there's two sides of the story. I'd be willing to bet if you go downstairs and stood on the street, you ask 100 people about can you be injured from a vaccine, I bet all 100 people will tell you no. And I guarantee you that if you ask them about, well, if you were injured from a vaccine, what would you do about it? And if they said, well, I'd sue somebody, I'd go right across the street. Right across the street from my office is our courthouse here, okay? And they said I'd go right across the street and I'd try to get justice. And then if you told them this part, oh, you can't get justice there. You can't bring your case there. You only can bring it one place in America, and that's in Washington, D.C. I bet their jaws would drop.
The problem is it's very controversial. Very, very few people get any money out of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund. And it's got about $3 billion in it right now. I have said to the pharmaceutical companies, I've called and talked to presidents of many of the major pharmaceutical companies in this country. And I said, you're concerned about class action lawsuits. For instance, if mercury in the vaccine caused damage to a large number of people, they could be sued and it could be fiscally disastrous for the pharmaceutical company. So what I said to the pharmaceutical company presidents, what I will do is I will sponsor legislation protecting you against class action lawsuits if, number one, you get the mercury and toxic chemicals out of all vaccines, and two, if you provide through the vaccination process more money to be put into the Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund to take care of people who have been damaged. But the Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund should be very accommodating to people who have been damaged. And I said, if we put more money into that fund, make it more user-friendly, then I will help to protect you against class action lawsuits. So far, there has been no positive response from any of the pharmaceutical companies. As a matter of fact, their organization that lobbies here in Washington, the head organization, Pharma, has been very adverse to any change in any of these laws or funds.
This is a total witch hunt against him. He's been accused of dealing with children in a way that the Department of Health chief should have dealt with children. We presented the Department of Health chiefs with a full list of 1,200 children and asked them to look at the background history
clinically investigate these children to determine why their lives change so shortly within the incubation period of a vaccine known to cause the problems that they've got. And that's why it is politically unsound what they're doing now, to attack doctors who've actually done the job.
We're not even allowed to ask questions about vaccine safety. Since when? Since when? I mean, the burning of the books was a long, long time ago. We're accused of, for example, conducting unnecessary invasive investigations on children for the purposes of research. Again, that is wholly untrue. We had symptomatic children of parents who were looking for the origin of their children's disease. We took those symptomatic children, we investigated them according to their symptoms, using routine clinical investigations, and we demonstrated that the parents were right, the children had a bowel disease that was treatable. So how that can be deemed to be in some way abuse of these children is beyond me. What is actually abuse of these children is to put them in a corner and pretend that just because they're autistic they're not entitled to have physical symptoms or bowel disease or any other manifestation of disease at all. And even if they do, then they're not deemed worthy of treatment. In 1995, I got a call from a mother who said my child was developing perfectly normally. He had his MMR vaccine, and then he disappeared. The lights in his eyes went out, he stopped speaking, he stopped interacting, he stopped playing, he just wasn't there anymore. Initially, I thought it was his hearing. He had that checked, it wasn't his hearing. And then he was diagnosed with autism. And I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, I know nothing about autism. It was so rare when I was at medical school, we weren't even taught about it. And she said, yes, but doctor, my child also has terrible bowel problems. He has diarrhea 10, 12 times a day, it's foul smelling, his abdomen is bloated. He's in pain, I know he's in pain. He can't tell me he's in pain. But as a mother, I know he's in pain. And I heard this story time and time again, and the story that there was now an epidemic of this disorder, that it used to be extremely rare, but now there were many, many, many parents saying exactly the same thing. So not only was there a behavioral problem, but there was a neurological problem. The children would start bumping into things. They wouldn't want to stand, they'd sit down, they'd lose the ability to stand. They could eat with a spoon, and now they could no longer eat with a spoon. They didn't want to go up or down the stairs. So they became unsteady. We called it ataxia. They became clumsy. And when we looked at it and published a great deal of work on this, it looked like it could be caused by a virus. And the work that we did in that suggested very strongly that elements, at least elements of that measles virus were there. And further work went on to suggest that it was likely that that vaccine, the virus came from the vaccine. And what was intriguing about that is that when we treated the inflammation with the sorts of drugs that we would use for Crohn's or colitis, then the bowel symptoms got better, the diarrhea got better, the pain went away, but also what was fascinating is the behavior improved. The child smiled, laughed, started talking for the first time in maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And that was fascinating. And so we said, well, that didn't happen. Did it again? It happened again. Did it again? It happened again, to a variable extent in each child, and it may simply be that the child was now no longer in pain.
When I finally understood that, it was so incontrovertibly true and so obvious that I couldn't look away anymore. I had to see the reality.
Yeah, it's coming over here. Come over here.
Let's fix the underlying problem and make them better. Let's see you. Do you want to? What are you doing? Do you want to stand up on my scale and see how big you are today? Yeah. Did you grow? Hold your hand up.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
9,
9, 10.
37. Very good. Camera.
He's on Mommy, you gotta take a picture, okay?
Yeah.
It's no Dr. Dream.
I'm not in there. Do you want to put me in there? Oh, I should be in my chair, shouldn't I?
Okay, he gotta take it.
You want Mommy to take the picture?
When he started preschool, he was labeled autistic, and now he's in a what they call an early childhood classroom for delays. And he's gone up to kids now and says, "Hi, will you play with me?" He loves getting pictures. He didn't used to like any of that. Didn't like to be held. Now he wants affection. So that's been the wonderful part, is we're getting a boy. We're getting to see who he was.
There's a prince.
Can you be like Daddy?
Okay.
Is that like Daddy? Yeah. Do you want to say hi?
No music.
There's no music?
No music.
Well, what good are the headphones if there's no music?
He gotta do it.
He's got to do it?
What is taking place in the intestine of children with autism, what has been demonstrated is indicative of an inflammatory or disease process. And what we find in the children with autism is that this area, the lymph glands, if you like, of the intestine become greatly swollen, as they do in children with food allergy or infection, that there is inflammation, so the numbers of these immune cells infiltrating into the bowel is greater in the children with autism. Now, lining the surface of the intestine are enzymes that digest our food. If those aren't working properly, which happens in children when they have inflammation of the bowel, then certain undigested molecules can get through. And some of those molecules will have neurotoxic activity. They are toxic to the brain. And certain molecules, such as those derived from gluten in wheat or from dairy products, casein, have morphine-like activity, very powerful opioid activity. And if they get in, do they then influence the development of the brain? It's biologically plausible, and it's something that needs to be examined. So is it possible that in some children with autism, inflammation in the intestine, perhaps due to a measles virus infection or some other infection, is setting the scene for a secondary activation of the immune system in the brain?
Your child gets a shot or you go to jail. That Get Tough policy right now in Prince George's County, Maryland. Today is the deadline for parents to get their children state-mandated vaccinations, prove they've already done it, or possibly face up to 10 days in the joint. Hundreds of anxious parents showed up at the county courthouse today for on-the-spot shots. Officials call the policy a last resort. Critics say it goes way too far.
You can't say no, because they'll put you in jail. They'll come arrest you for child abuse. They'll take your child away. They won't let them go to school. But it's got a black box warning, so they told you could cause it. But if you don't agree to it, you cannot have informed consent when you have mandatory vaccines. If you got a problem, you got to make it optional. Then you got informed consent.
I mean, what greater right is there than the right to self-determination, the right to decide what you're willing to risk your life or your child's life for? And this is really what we're talking about. Are we going to be free to have all accurate information about the benefits and risks of vaccines, about the risks and complications of diseases, and be able to make informed voluntary decisions about which risk to take?
Public health says, and they're right, that doesn't work for them. We got to mandate everything, because otherwise people aren't going to necessarily decide the way they want you to decide. I don't think that's appropriate. I think it's fine for them to give us information. It has to be accurate. And hopefully they'll make good enough vaccines that we'll all choose to take them, because we don't like infectious disease. They cannot mandate us to take it, and they can't lie to us.
Do you believe anybody who's getting funds from Merck or any of the other pharmaceutical companies should be on advisory panels that are making judgments about pharmaceuticals coming from those companies? Or do you believe that's a conflict of interest?
I think that's a difficult question to answer.
Wait a minute, let me get this straight. You think it's a difficult question to answer if somebody is getting funding of some type from a pharmaceutical company for them to sit on an advisory panel that's approving or giving their approval to a new drug that's coming on the market? You don't see that as a conflict?
It's important to point out that recommendations for vaccination are made independently by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Family Physicians. And those recommendations are virtually always in harmony with the recommendations from the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices.
The pharmaceutical industry is probably the most powerful lobbying force in Washington, D.C. There are 535 members of Congress, the House and the Senate. There are over 600 lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry. They are a very powerful force. They give a lot of money to both political parties. They give a lot of money to individual candidates. They don't give me any, but they give an awful lot of money to various candidates, and they have a very strong lobbying effort. And so getting anything done in Congress that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't want done is very, very difficult. That is one of the problems. The other problem is they have very, very strong influence with the Food and Drug Administration and Health and Human Services and CDC. And because of their strength, it's very difficult to get change made.
As soon as there was a doubt, in any case a hypothesis, about the vaccine origin of macrophagic myofasciitis, of course we went to the pharmaceutical industry to seek their opinion and to create common research projects. Even if our first meetings seemed friendly enough, they went well, we very quickly understood that they had no desire for this partnership to exist, and that all the research, in fact from their side, their objective was to show that there was no such link. Very quickly our points of view diverged, whereas at the beginning we naively thought that we were working together to the same end. The whole time everything was done so that our own research would never be completed, and that their research proving their objective would appear rapidly and be published and aired in public. All that is a little bit surprising. It causes a problem because we are, above all, university hospital doctors, and that whatever the causes and mechanisms, the research into and the understanding of illness are supposed to advance.
I'm afraid that once you offend the system has a way of taking its revenge. It hopes that by discrediting me, it will set an example, I guess, to the other members of the medical profession who otherwise might get involved in helping these children. And that doctors will melt away, dissent will melt away, and everything can continue just as it was before. Well, it can't, and it won't. Because the parents aren't going to go away, the children aren't going away, they're not going to change their story because it doesn't suit the belief of the public health system or the governments or the drug industry. That's not going to happen. And while they're there, well, I'll be there too, and so will my colleagues, trying to unravel this particular mystery.
It's not true to say that no one ever thought vaccines could not have a harmful effect. That's been known since the very beginnings. Since the start of the 19th century, we know that vaccine strategies have proved their great worth in the field of human health. And we also know that there's a variable percentage, a quantifiable one, of negative side effects. The question needs to be asked this way. Vaccination, yes. Issues of safety and security in health products should not be seen as the enemy of vaccines. Both should be developed, and we'll develop better vaccine strategies and have them accepted more easily by the general public if we can truly guarantee good surveillance of all the various side effects. There will always be side effects, but instead of denying them, we should confront them and deal with them. That way, we'll learn how to make vaccines, better vaccines, and minimize as much as possible the inherent risk in their use.
I mean, we're talking today about autism, but there's something even or as great at stake here as the autism question and whether or not the MMR vaccine and other vaccines may be contributing to autism. And that is, are we letting pharmaceutical companies have too great an influence on the decision-making process that affects every one of our lives? Do we want to give a child 9 vaccinations in one day? Do we want to give them 31 or 32 or 33 vaccinations between the time they're born and their age 6? Isn't that maybe a little bit overload? That's the whole question.
Until we do the basic science research and find out, we're always going to be saying either it's a coincidence or I know for sure my child was injured by a vaccine. So I believe that the answer lies in the good science. And we have had a lot of bad science. And we need to get down and do the good science. And that will give us the answers to this outstanding question about how many children are really being hurt by vaccination.
Are you going to get married?
No.
No, why not?
I don't want to.
Oh, okay. But you could if you wanted to.
Yes.
All right.
Do you have anything else you want to say? Yes. One more thing. I hope the autistic kids get well. I hope they get alive. I hope they get a good job.
Make a billion, Angela.